Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Laura K. Field, political theorist and author of Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. Laura, thanks so much for joining us. This is a sort of an intellectual history, I guess, book you could call it, or a almost like an autopsy. Or maybe
I wish it was an autopsy.
Maybe not so much. What's the word when they a vivisection? Is that what it is? It's a vivisection of the intellectual undergirding of what we know as the MAGA movement today. Let's start with just, and I want to get to the sort of the four different sort of elements that you talk about that make up what we know as MAGA: the Claremonters, the post-liberals, the national conservatives or NatCons, and the hard right underbelly, as you call it. But before we get there, let's start with Leo Strauss. I first really sort of dug into this, I guess it was 20 years ago when I interviewed a guy, James Mann, I think it was, who wrote The Rise of the Vulcans, when he was talking about the Straussians in the Bush White House. But tell us about Leo Strauss and where follow through where Leo Strauss takes us into at least one of those four groups.
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. So Leo Strauss was a German emigre, Jewish German emigre from Germany who left Germany in the interwar period. He was a wonderful political philosopher who sort of studied the great tradition of great books. And my connection is I studied with a bunch of Straussian, sort of these conservative intellectuals. Many of them are conservatives. He didn't identify as a conservative. And he's known for sort of different things, but mainly sort of recovering what is called the esoteric tradition in political philosophy, which is this idea that many of these older books, these canonical texts, were written in this multi-layered way to either avoid persecution on the part of the writer or to sort of include some hidden messages, right? Or talk to different types of readers in different ways, or just to prevent sort of dogmatism. So as a pedagogical practice. But he was very influential. He's had some very famous students, including like Alan Bloom, and many neoconservatives had some connection to Leo Strauss. He's also had a lot of liberal students. So I think some of that stuff got a little conspiratorial. Just because he's a person who had a more immense influence, and then his students went in all kinds of directions. But there's a kind of tidy connection between Leo Strauss and then one of his most famous students, Harry Jaffa, who was a Lincoln scholar who sort of took the Straussian method and that applied it to American history in an interesting way. And he's quite well respected. But several students of Harry Jaffa, founded the Claremont Institute in Claremont, California, which is not affiliated with the Claremont schools. And these students of Jaffa idolized Abraham Lincoln and the founders. And these students of Jaffa, I think, went even further than Harry Jaffa did in this kind of dogmatic, jingoistic understanding of the founding that sort of allows for no historical change away from their ideal of the founding principles, and have been critiquing the administrative state for decades now. And sort of has just stood opposed to any kind of critique of the founding. So they lost their minds over the 1619 Project, for example. So these students have been at the real forefront of a defense of Trumpism intellectually. And so my book starts with what I call the Claremonters. That's this one section because they sort of led the charge in defending Trumpism from an intellectual perspective. My book is very squarely focused on one slice of MAGA, and that's the ideologues.
One of the things that I recall about the Straussians was just this notion of there was something that was what I perceived as anti-democratic in the sense that there was an aristocratic or impulse, or just a notion of like, which we've seen in a lot of other traditions too, like even the progressives of the early 20th century had the same sort of like, we understand things that you plebes don't really understand.
You don't. Yeah.
And so how much of that, like, that certainly was there with the neocons. I mean, as far as I remember, like, like the sort of the Rumsfeld but how much of that went into, because that's sort of like, everybody seems to have taken that gene and
Yeah.
just gone with it in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think a very fair critique, not just of the Straussians, though I think you're right. There's a kind of sensibility to it or a flavor to it that's super elitist. And so that's partly how this sort of esotericism takes off in these groups of young people studying Straussian political philosophy. I mean, I kind of experienced some of that too, where you feel like you're being initiated into the secret teachings, and that's really seductive, right? And so that there's something anti-democratic in it. There's a lot that's anti-democratic in it, and then there's anti-democratic threads just throughout the right and throughout right-wing intellectualism as well that sort of get layered on. But the people I'm writing about, so there's some of them would consider themselves Straussians, others don't. But I think the elitism and this kind of idea that they have this super insight that they know what the people need better than the rest of us. I mean, the best example of this is Patrick Deneen's, who's got this theory that he calls now aristopopulism, right? So it's like,
Yeah, but I want to get to
yeah,
that because I don't want to
sure.
jump too far ahead. I want to go through
Okay.
this development because you can take the Straussians and it'll take you into Claremont and via Jaffa, who I guess Jaffa was the one who I believe it was gave Goldwater's that line about in defense of their extremism is no vice in defense of liberty. So
Yeah.
essentially, like as long as you think you're right. I mean, this is like always. This is the Straussian part in my mind. Is like they're all convinced. If you come from that tradition, you're convinced that you are right, and
Yeah.
and that takes can take multiple different forms. Whether it's a certain like race essentialism or whether it's like a religious nationalism. As long as you feel like you're the one who understands things and you have the secret, it could take many flavors. And so Goldwater famously says this: there is no such thing as being too extreme if you're in pursuit of liberty. But of course,
Everyone thinks they know the right. Yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
thinks they know what the liberty is in that situation. Okay, so let's go to we've talked about the just tell us about the Claremonters, just in and of itself, and then
Yeah.
we'll go to the post liberals and the nat cons, and I guess we get to the Deanan and the post liberals.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So today the Claremonters, they're still obsessed with the American founding as they understand it, and the irony here is that Jaffa was quite an egalitarian and sort of a declarationist. So always vaunting the Declaration of Independence and especially the principle of equality, especially relative to his conservative sort of followers or his conservative enemies on the right. That today, so they still have this mission, but I think it's kind of been corrupted by. Um, First, the kind of dogmatic attachment to those principles, such that they can't stand the administrative state, they can't stand the New Deal, they can't stand the civil rights movement, in effect, because all of those changes they see as these alarming departures from that original model. So everything's this alarming transformation. And it's also been corrupted by, I think, a kind of nativism and insularity. So and sometimes they're explicit about how they've turned their back on the Jaffa-esque commitment to equality in the Declaration of Independence and are attached to a kind of nativism and sort of so. But the main person here to look to for this is a fellow named Michael Anton, who wrote this first defense of Trump, the Flight 93 election, the premise of which was that if you were to elect Hillary Clinton, this was in 2016, it would be certain death to the American Republic. So what you needed to do is just like the brave passengers on the Flight 93 on September 11th, you needed to charge the cockpit, and that's what it meant to vote for Trump, to elect Trump, because at least then you had some chance of sort of redirecting things and saving America. So that's the kind of alarmist, catastrophizing outlook that he articulated. It's partly, and that sort of that energy has continued on the new right, and he's been a real leader. I mean, he wrote the new national security strategy report, or he was one of the main authors. So you have this kind of um, devastating catastrophism, right? And this idea that it's always just we're just on the brink of total destruction, and and it's also his understanding is that conservatism was never enough, and that the old conservative establishment was not able to conserve anything, and so now counter-revolutionary measures are necessary, and that's basically the mood at the Claremont Institute.
So, in the parlance of someone who is not an academic, I would
Mhm.
say like they're about as bat crap crazy as it gets in terms of
Yeah.
like calling themselves an institute, and their fervor is super intense. Like
Yeah.
whenever I have come across like the Claremont Institute, I'm like, oh my god, like what is going on there? And so it's super intense in a more sort of like colloquial
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's kind of there's a kind of masculinist fervor to it. It's not sort of in the depth, it's not the worst of these people. And I think the sad thing is that they've got this inheritance from Harry Jaffa that was kind of serious, and they've got this publication called the Claremont Review of Books that publishes some serious articles for the last few decades. I mean, I've got friends who have published in there. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but then and they still publish some interesting stuff. Even
um
though, I mean, but the institution has also lost a lot of its reputation, and then they publish this other online magazine called The American Mind that's just like absolute filth as far as I'm concerned, crazy. And so there's this kind of dance they're doing where there's still kind of a veneer of respectability, and yet there's some really awful stuff happening.
All right, well, let's move over to the post liberals. And I have to say, like, you can see throughout all of these, there's like strands of each within each other. These are not so discrete. Like this is the Venn diagram would have a lot of like sort of like crossover here
Yeah.
because I think you could argue in many respects, like the Claremont Institute is post-liberal in the sense that they're like, we got to throw over this existing order of,
Yeah.
and we should say, we're not talking liberal in the capital L version. We're talking in the small L version, I guess, where we're talking more like the idea of, well, explain,
Well, I mean, let me say a little bit about that because I think you're right in general that there's a kind of the Claremonters would say that they are counter-revolutionary and they want to bring us back probably to something like a Republican small government tradition, but they probably would also be okay with they would say they're okay with some small liberal principles.
all right. Well,
Um,
explain people to people like when we're talking about in terms of liberal
yeah.
principles, we're talking about like
Just like
some type
liberal
of like
democracy writ large, so rule of law,
individual.
free
Yeah.
press, individual rights and liberties, checks and balances, right?
So they would
And
allow for some of that.
well, they'd say that the constitutional order was organized with those things in mind. This is what there's sort of different tiers, right? There's the upper echelons of the place, and then there's the gutter stuff. And so they'd say the upper echelons will be like, we're the true defenders of those things. And then the people on the bottom are like, actually, we're not. They get pretty racist and weird. So it's mixed bag, but with the post liberals, which is this other group, which is mainly made up of socially conservative Catholics, um, and they self-identify as post-liberals, and their critique of the current sort of regime or the current situation in America reaches back to the American founding. Many of them say the American founding was kind of a mistake because it was liberal. So their critique is more radical. They see liberalism with again small L. So we're not talking about partisanship in the
Right.
in like liberals versus conservatives. Not quite, though. It's
There's some
messy.
crossover there too,
Yeah,
but
sure. But they would see most sort of small c conservatives as liberals in the classical sense, right? So their critique is very radical of the whole establishment and of the American founding because someone like Patrick Deneen, who wrote this book, Why Liberalism Failed in 2018, which was sort of Obama put on his reading list, he says, liberal democracy is flawed from the beginning, and it's got this sort of rancid individualism that means that the more it succeeds, the more it fails, because liberal individualism eats away at the ties that bind. It has a disintegrative effect on our social bonds, on community, on family. And what happens then is and we can see there's some truth to this, right? We do have just, people struggle with loneliness. There's individualism has its problems, but then he says, so what you kind of can expect with liberalism is that eventually a strong man is going to be brought in to fix these problems. Liberals can't tell, there's just all these problems with liberalism.
Well,
And so the
isn't
post-liberals, that's their starting point.
isn't the liberalism that they're talking about? Because when I think of this, I think of Peter Thiel, who, like, I don't know, a year ago famously said, like, or had the idea that, the problem with liberalism is that you end up giving women the vote, and then you end up in getting socialism, or that we are tired of the liberal order. And he's looking, we're in 1921 right now, or 1931. I can't remember which date he said, but basically arguing like, we're tired of liberalism. We're ready for that strong man. I mean, it seems to me when they're talking about that individualism, what they're talking about is the emancipatory movements of women, of Black people, of brown people, anybody who's been marginalized in society up until, I don't know, the 1930s, or 40s or 50s or 60s, and starting to get their individual rights without being, because when they're talking about the collective, what they're really talking about is a hierarchy that is either a racial or a patriarchy, right?
Yeah, no, I'm in total agreement. I mean, I think that someone like Patrick Deneen would deny that completely and say, of course, there have been some good things about liberalism, but historically, his critique tracks very well to what you're describing as the emancipatory, transformation of our society, and this, a pretty wonderful and, shift in who has some status in our society. And so I think he's in a real bind there. I will say he's also the post-liberals. I mean, if we're to do them the most justice we can, I think they for them, and it's not just Deneen, it's people like Sohrab Ahmari, Adrian Vermeule at Harvard. There are some pretty serious people in this camp, and some important policy people who they care about the economics of liberalism. And part of their criticism is of sort of what we would call neoliberal economics. And so I think that that's an important kind of distinction between them and the Claremonters. And they're sort of the most serious in terms of sort of putting forward some policy proposals that I think sometimes people on the left might really appreciate. The trouble is they also want to conjoin this with like the abandonment of the separation of church and state. And they've got this sort of aristopopulist ideas that say what we are seeking is the common good, and we get to define that, and we then get to use the levers of power once we take over the state to impose those moral principles on the rest of society.
Well, there is a growing, I just think it's important to say liberalism too, and neoliberalism, liberal economics failing, right? Trump came on the scene in part due critiquing free trade, critiquing Hillary Clinton and NAFTA. And then even Biden, despite not being like a radical leftist, understood that there had to be like direct intervention in the market, particularly in the wake of COVID, to kind of get the economy moving. Both of these visions are recognizing the failures of liberal economics and are both advocating for a more direct state intervention in the economy and in society, and a stronger state. The one on the left is a more collectivist vision, hopefully, and there should be. I wish there were more Democrats that subscribe to it. But on the right, as you're saying, they'll say collectivist, but it's about the hierarchy of the group that they're advocating for. And instead of a vision of like democracy, which can be compatible with a left-wing vision, it's the strongman, the autocrat that does that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how I think about it as well.
I did a thing on CNN a week or two ago with some type of Christian conservatives. We were walking off. We were talking about. I was talking about Mamdani, and he was saying like, "Yeah, I really want." I said, I don't understand. I can't remember how we got onto this conversation, but I was saying, yeah, Mamdani, like the universal childcare is going to be amazing. Because he was saying, I really want families to be able to like not feel the pressure and have more kids. That's what it was. He was saying, like, we need to have more kids. Right. And I said, well, then you must really like the free childcare. And he's like, well, I want to see wages go up so that we don't have to have both parents working.
Exactly.
And it took like 2 minutes to realize like he didn't want free childcare, which would take the stress off of people, because that would mean that mom could go and work.
I
And he
know.
doesn't
So that's
want mom to
exactly what
work.
you have to keep an eye on. I mean, I think some of these people are pretty sincere, and I mean, I was at an
He
event.
seems sincere.
No,
he
but let me
also
just
seemed
say,
like-
some of these guys are sincere in the sense that I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and the editor of Compact magazine, Matthew Schmitz, was asked, who's the most post-liberal president we've seen or politician? And he said Joe Biden, and that's because of the infrastructure bill, right? And some of these things. And some of these people are for a child tax credit, but I think most of them are much more for like the Viktor Orban model, right? Where it's like exactly what you're describing. They want women at home, and I think women should have the choice, and so should fathers. So, you know, there is some overlap there, but they don't want, I don't think they are accepting of gay marriage. And so, you know, the people getting these benefits in their world will be traditional families, right? And maybe not even single mothers. I mean, it's very conservative in that old, you know, social conservative sense. And they want to empower the state perhaps to do some of these social programs that I would be all for, but they also want to use it to do things like, you know, claw back marriage equality, and do all kinds of other incentives to kind of shift back the demographic.
Is J.D. Vance of that ilk? Like, I mean, it seems like the Opus Dei people, like the Peter Thiel, like the hardcore, like there's a new strain of like trad wife, and like are all like seem to be in that sort of like hardcore Catholic. I mean, I'm trying to like
it's pretty messy. Yes, I think J.D. Vance has identified with the post-liberal groups. I saw him at the book launch for Patrick Deneen's next book called Regime Change. But he's kind of got his fingerprints all over the New Right. I mean, all of these different categories that I talk about. He's spoken, the Claremont people love him. Thiel's connected to the Claremont people as well as the NatCons, as well as J.D. Vance, clearly. And he's spoken at the National Conservative Conferences. I think I see it as a real coup for the New Right that they have elevated J.D. Vance so high. I think he's really their boy, and they're thrilled by everything he does.
Let's talk about the NatCons. Like, where are the NatCons in this? Are they sort of the I mean, they're
I think of them as like they're the organizers, and sort of they're this sort of big tent, messy. They'll welcome everybody. Sometimes the post-liberals don't go to those there's some schisms there. There's a few disagreements, partly about economics, partly about foreign affairs, but they basically are like,
Kevin Roberts, the sort of like besieged head of the Heritage Foundation. Is he a NatCon?
He has definitely spoken at NatCon, and he gave a very telling. I mean, the story I tell in the book is that the group sort of emerged under the first Trump administration, but then they really consolidated power in the second administration, under Biden. And there was this moment, I think it was in 2022, when Kevin Roberts had been made president of the Heritage Foundation the year prior. And then he went to the NatCon conference and he said to them, I'm here as a representative basically of like Conservatism Inc., this, you know, vaunted organization. And I'm here to say, we are joining you. We're not here to support you. We're here to join you and recognize that you have led the way. And so it was kind of this moment where the right just got on board with the radical agenda of these intellectuals and signaled that we are sort of departing from our old model. And the NatCons in general are driven by nationalism. And that means sort of old-fashioned capital N nationalism, not just patriotism. It's a sort of turn against the kind of creedal Americanism that says we are united by ideas and principles, not by the color of our skin. So the NatCon leader, Yoram Hazony, is this Israeli American scholar who defends nationalism, saying what you need in politics is a relatively homogenous nation, homogenous in terms of culture, language, history, religion. He doesn't say ethnicity, but you can easily see how that tips into a kind of ethno-nationalism. And certainly that's been the big question with the NatCon since the beginnings of their movement. And I do track in my book how they started off saying we don't want any racists here at our conference, and then gradually the doors kind of opened to some pretty unsavory
realized, like, actually,
Well, that's
it
the
turns
whole.
out
Well,
we're
you're
sort of
okay. I
racist.
mean, maybe not you, but Darren Beatty, yeah, you come and give us a speech. And there's a few people like that. Amy
And-
Wax was there. There's a long list.
And
Well-
they're also like Christian nationalists too, fall in here, right? For the most part,
Many of
as
them
long-
are. And
Okay.
Hazony, despite being Jewish, has said Christian nationalism is the only way to defeat the religion of woke neo-Marxism.
Well, Christian nationalism for the United States.
Israel gets-
Israel gets,
some
yeah,
type of
Jewish
like
nationalism.
a Jewish nationalism for Israel.
Absolutely. And that's, I mean, part of the funny thing here is they talk, Yoram Hazony quotes John Stuart Mill when he talks about the diversity of nation states. So he says, I'm not opposed to diversity. I just don't want any diversity internally.
Right. Well, that's also Nick Fuentes' argument about, races is like,
Yeah.
I don't hate them. I just don't want them
Yeah.
near me.
It's why Richard Spencer, despite being a white nationalist Nazi, supports the state of Israel, because they believe that these demographics should have their own enclaves. Once again, the rejection of liberalism, or about conservative rejection of liberalism being about imposing a hierarchy, is really important to point out. And I wonder how you feel this new kind of intellectual movement on the right fits into the idea of migration, and the more that we're going to be seeing due to climate change, potentially billions of people, but millions and millions of people being displaced due to the conditions that are being created by climate change, and how liberalism as a concept that also includes potentially more liberal border policies and things like that have influenced this movement's like rejection of multiculturalism.
Well, it's their big boogeyman, right? Is immigration, and it's been a big sort of linchpin of their policy ideas from the very beginning. Michael Anton defined Trumpism as economic nationalism, secure borders, and America First foreign policy. And he's really been at the foreground of trying to shut down the borders and end birthright citizenship and all of this. And I mean, I think it's so tricky because obviously some of the American people are right there with Michael Anton. And they're able to fearmonger on this issue and kind of override, I think, the facts on the ground about the contributions that people make to our country, and and just the importance of these norms of liberal internationalism that allow asylum seekers and refugees to move around the world. And a lot of it is like our politics have failed over the last 20 years to give people a decent life and have a path to citizenship. And I don't blame the Democrats for that as much as the Republicans, because I think that there hasn't. I don't study this carefully. I think there have been some really good faith efforts to do that. And some of the old Republicans used to also at least pay lip service to that. So, I mean, the country has failed on that issue. And I don't know. I mean, it is hard because things are so vicious right now, right? And so heartbreaking and cruel that it's hard to want to talk reasonably about the issue. Right. And I think for liberals, because it's hard to even acknowledge that there might be an immigration issue because of what they're doing. I mean, so I think it's really a mess. And I mean, to me, it's just.
So what you're saying is
maybe you guys
it's
take
hard
me
to
somewhere
talk-
else.
It's hard to talk about it in the context of a policy prescription when you're fighting against like fascistic forces.
Yeah, and the last thing you want to do is give any credence to their
Yes.
bigotry and just the absolute horror show of what's unfolding. I mean,
Yes.
and
I
so
think that's the case with frankly a lot of things in this context. All right, well, let's talk about the hard right underbelly, because this is like you write about it as an intellectual movement, and we see it in the context of we sort of see all of this in the context of like our YouTube world and podcast world, frankly.
Right.
But this is the most sort of like YouTubian, I think, of the of the four.
Oh, YouTubian, huh?
Well, I mean, you
here.
write about the Bronze Age pervert. I mean, so it's like that's the guy's moniker. I mean, that's, you're not going to get into the Claremont Institute calling yourself that at least for another couple of years, I would say, probably. But tell us
But he's
about
not unconnected, right? I mean, they wrote this big article.
I think more and more they're really congealing. And well, that's the point, right? That's MAGA.
Yeah. That's what, and I do sort of, I mean, I didn't expect to be ever in my life writing about people like Bronze Age pervert and raw egg nationalist. And there are others, Michael Millerman, Darren Beatty, all of whom have PhDs, right? And some of whom have PhDs in Straussian political philosophy. They've written dissertations on Nietzsche and Leo Strauss. And that's a world I'm very familiar with. And so I couldn't not include them, and partly because they've gained a ton of traction and influence, not just on YouTube, but, on Twitter, and they're selling, a lot of books, and they're writing sort of semi-serious, semi-grotesque books that are fascist, that are extremely misogynist, and they're kind of taking off, in these sort of dark places.
Well, are they? I mean, I want you to explain them, but in terms of like a chicken and egg, in 2016, 2015, one of our former producers here, Matt Binder, was like, when he was filling in on Mondays for me, he's like, I want to do this stuff about Gamergate and men's rights activists. And I'm like, oh, dude, that's not politics. And, but I'm like, well, but go ahead. And, then like 6 months later, they're all at the White House podium giving the white power sign. So, like, did they come first? Did the intellectuals who that you're writing about, these guys who are the PhDs, who are still like sort of like fascistic and misogynist and whatnot, did they just simply follow like where the Gamergate people were and the men's rights activists and the Cernoviches and the Fuentes and the Spencers and whatnot?
Some of it is that. I mean, I was surprised. The more I did the research, the more I discovered that some of these guys, and the best example is Michael Anton, who, again, he's not necessarily in the gutter with these guys, but he's friends with many of them, is my impression. And he was involved in the pickup artist community, at least to the extent where he was constantly posting about it and or writing about it. He'd published an academic paper called Socrates as Pickup Artist. And so they were kind of immersed in that, some of these guys in that world. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? So he's got this, I mean, it's crazy. So you have that, and you have someone like Bronze Age pervert, or Costin Maria is his name, who was, studying at Yale and had this kind of dual life where he was also writing this book, Bronze Age Mindset, while he was trying to continue his academic career. I mean, the academic career ended before that stuff really exploded. And so, I think they were just immersed in that stuff, and obviously very sympathetic to a lot of it. And some of it, I mean, if you think about Duke, a lot of that, it was Gamergate that started it. There was also this lacrosse case where the Duke lacrosse team was accused of rape, and that was really important to someone like Stephen Miller. And I think in that case, these guys were right. They were onto something. And so they've got these kind of half-baked, some of it's totally half-baked, a lot of it's really vicious, but they've got this sort of way of framing things that's really catchy. They've got these phrases like gynocracy, the longhouse, the cathedral, right? Curtis Yarvin is another one of these guys. And they're funny, I don't think you can deny that Bronze Age Mindset is in some ways a funny book and a smart book, even though, I mean, it's also just like rancid. Like I think, but there's this strange melange, right? Which is very typical of fascist thinking also, right? There's this kind of high, great man stuff. Like, we got to build the new man, the mensch, there's this really highfalutin stuff. And like, I mean, I've written, my dissertation was about Nietzsche. Like, I love that stuff. I can get into it. And part of what I was trying to do with the book was show how you could be drawn to some of this, why it's appealing, and I think it doesn't take much to see that once you're kind of, I mean, I don't recommend this, right? But you start reading this stuff, you can at least see the humor there. And it does say something about our sort of humorless society sometimes, right? That these guys are really, I think, thirsting for some. I mean, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying,
no, I understand.
You got to understand it.
I mean, I think, and this is why you see like sort of on the perimeter of this stuff, and maybe not even so much on the perimeter of it, but like, Gavin McGinnis and folks like that. And then even as far as
Andrew
like,
Tate.
sort of like the,
Yeah.
well, Andrew Tate and the sort of like mothership comedians are all sort of like on the perimeter of this stuff, and some are a little bit more in. So this is like a milieu that all these things sort of come together. And but is part of it like, when I was reading about like the Dime Square stuff, which I was aware of prior, and Red Scare I don't think was ever really quite as left as they sort of
Probably
postured. I think it was just they were riding a podcast wave that was more about like, what was happening. But the thing that has always occurred to me about that ilk of people was losers who, with all due respect to everybody, but as defined by their own sense of of aggrievement, like not necessarily, like a sense of feeling like I'm not part of the cool kids, and this is an opportunity for me to be a cool kid. Like when I see like even like whether it's Curtis Yarvin, like he's wearing the leather coat, and it's almost like, dude, this is a stage that you're supposed to go through when you thought you were a motorcycle guy back like when you were 17, but he couldn't probably in high school. And I'm not speaking as someone who was like that. I was not. Surprise, surprise. Also wearing a leather coat or being one of the cool kids. I wore a sweater vest in high school.
That was pretty cool.
But there is this quality, it seems to me, that all of this Ubermensch stuff, all of this sort of like reasserting, relying on a hierarchy that is given from God or from some higher power, or just the sense of the way that things should be, makes it much easier for me as a guy who is uncomfortable within the world to sort of like know my place, get my place, have it there. I'm just sliding into this. I don't have to, there is that to me seems like, because if, you look from whether it's like Mike Lindell and Steve Bannon and all the Breitbart thing, I mean, Andrew Breitbart, the sense of being aggrieved by Hollywood was his fundamental building block for everything. And Ben Shapiro, I mean, all of these people have been rejected in some manner by what they thought was cool. And this is the way they struck back, and they built all these things. I mean, Gamergate came out of Breitbart and Bannon and Milo Yiannopoulos and now like, Fuente. I mean, you see all the lineage there. At its heart, there's this sense of like aggrievement and sense that like I should be in a better position than I am. And now I've created a theoretical framework where it's going to be much easier for me to step into.
Yeah, I mean, I am pro describing these people as losers. But and I think partly what we need to do is like point that out and mock them. But I also, I guess, to be a little, maybe, I don't think this is controversial, but I think that we've got to address, and I don't mean that across the board, right? I mean, because I'm trying to be careful in the book and generous, right? I think we have to also be generous. And I guess it's fine to say that about the people, many of the people who are doing some of the worst work, right? Like Christopher Rufo and like go off. But I think we have to be careful because there's something happening here where a lot of people are being drawn to it who I don't think are losers, right? And I think deserve some generosity. And we're not being, and I think as a culture and as liberals, we're not very good at talking to them. And part of what I try to articulate, I mean, I'm a political theorist by training, but I'm not like a liberal theorist insofar as like I haven't studied John Rawls very carefully, and I wrote about Rousseau and Nietzsche. And I love Plato, right? So I love a lot of this sort of old stuff. But one of the problems with liberalism, and I'm a good liberal, right? Like I love liberal democracy. But one of the problems with liberal from like a social cultural perspective is that it doesn't tell us how to live our lives. That's also one of the great things about liberalism, right? We get choice, we get our right to choose. We get to decide what sort of culture we want to be part of when we're adults, right? We get to kind of, design our own life. And that's the whole point of liberal democracy. It's not going to kind of hand down one religion, one sort of comprehensive doctrine by which to live. The problem though is that it leaves a kind of vacuum, right? Where liberals don't often know how to talk about the good, right? And one of the strange things happening on the right, part of it's just this fascism, like great man talk, but part of it's that they're using this language of moral values, of ends and purposes. Christopher Rufo constantly talks about the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? And they're providing answers to young people about how to live. They're saying liberalism's not going to tell you, but we sure as hell can, right?
Mhm.
We've got a gym for you to join. We've got, podcasts for you to listen to. A lot of these people have very popular YouTube channels where they do book clubs about, Homer and Leo Strauss. And so, that stuff is captivating. I can see how a lot of young men are drawn to that, especially because, and I love universities. I think there's tons of great work being done. I am not anti-woke. I'm not anti-CRT, but the universities don't often provide, or I don't think provide enough opportunity for young people to read these great books, to study the traditions of America, to study American history. And I mean woke and anti-woke history, right? There's just not that kind of liberal arts education. And conservatives have been griping about this for decades. There is a lot going on in higher ed, right? And I don't want to sort of beat that horse to death, but there are some real problems here.
Well,
And they
but
are exploiting them,
yeah,
right? To these very nefarious ends.
the elephant in the room here, in my view, is capitalism and where we're at right now with income and wealth inequality. When you have we can talk about young men and then have empathy for them in this way, where we as women are taught a lot of things about how we should behave socially, but men are taught things like you're there to be a provider, you are there to make money, you're there to build out your family, the American dream, etc. And increasingly, due to the levels of income and wealth inequality that we have in this country, that is impossible for people. So they're going to look for a sense of purpose or community or self-actualization outside of that. And liberals, I don't think really are capable of providing that right now, because you need more of like a left-wing, clearer vision. The right is providing that. And you see this throughout fascist movements in history, especially when the economy is poor. You have like answers of like, communities that focus on masculinity and tying masculinity to economic empowerment and social empowerment, and defining what that masculinity is in a very specific and usually eventually harmful context. And that's like what this is doing here. And we shouldn't, to your point, turn our nose at it without having an alternative. Turn up our nose.
I totally agree. I mean, there's a kind of thwarted, I think that the economic struggles and the inequality are a massive part of it. And I think the Democratic Party often doesn't seem able to even admit that, right? It seems like with Biden, I mean, I think that the prices and stuff, they didn't seem to even admit that that was a problem. And so you get with these young men, I think you get not only the economic struggle and like there's not really or at least they feel like there's nowhere for them to go, even though I think it's a little overstated on their part, and I do get tired of the grievances. But they don't have that opportunity, and they certainly feel like they don't have that any kind of honorable way forward in their life, and so they feel thwarted. And I think that's a real thing. I think young women feel that way too. I mean, there's a lot of anger to go around. But it's a real thing, and it's being so I think it's a problem that people on the left and the right and the center need to, and independents need to really confront and just be honest about, in my view.
And
I think the idea is that I think at least from our perspective in this corner, that it's you need at least some iteration of a leftist ideology to address these things, because of the crisis we're in now and the rolling one. There is, both from an economic standpoint, but also from like a social cachet,
Yeah.
the experience of white men, boys, whatnot, there is a real loss of social cachet, regardless of where they are on where they are relative to class, because there's a certain zero sum quality about this. It's like, if you've been sitting atop of a hierarchy where everybody else is tied for second place, and you're in first place in the way that society reflects you, when people start moving in and everybody's more, trying to be tied for first place, you're going to feel a loss. Because really what's happening is you're going down to second place with everybody else, or however you want to describe it. And so there is a sense of loss, and we as a society have not provided we've provided a justification for why that's the case, but we haven't provided a solution as to how to like make this a soft landing. And to the extent that it's necessary to provide that, it's to prevent other people or say like, you got to go back up to the top because there is no soft landing. That's what we're competing against.
Yeah. And just on a kind of like cultural level, we have to, I think, find better ways to talk about this so that it's not a zero, so that people don't see it as a zero sum game. I mean, there's got to be a way to think about our culture and think about different ways to flourish, different, ways for people to get ahead that don't, I mean, there's just so many things to do in life, right? It's not just a constant competition to be in one place or another. I mean, finances are a different thing, right? And economics is kind of a zero sum thing, but I don't pretend to be an economist, but I mean, and just in terms of like all the life paths that are available to people, we have to find an economic system and I think partly just a way to articulate possibilities, right? That are pluralist and that don't just involve some people winning, other people losing, and that doesn't have so much to do with identity.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a little bit zero summy on this.
Yeah, and I think that's probably right in terms of economics. I think about so much about higher education because that's the world I'm familiar with.
I'm not even talking about economics though. I'm just, I've used this example many times, but when I was growing up, every TV show, every commercial, I was centered in it in some form or another.
Oh, I see.
It was either about my mom or it was about my future wife and right. Now I'm looking at Cialis commercials and it's a black guy.
Yeah. And there's only so much bandwidth. And that's that. And we gotta, but yeah. And that's where I'm like, but I think we have to talk to young white men and say, their win is not your loss. It's actually good for you. Right. I mean, it's good for you that more people are celebrated. Our country is stronger because of that. Right. I mean, it's hard to not sound cliche, but it's true. I mean, I've got 2 white kids, little boys, and they're not harmed by, these new, different ads with black kids in them.
That's what's important is making the case for multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And again, I know that you're in the theory space, but we're critical of the Democratic Party for this very reason. Like ceding multiculturalism should be a part, and this country being a nation of immigrants and all of that should be at the center of people's civic minds once again. Yeah. But we have a vacuum that isn't being filled. And when you talk about higher education, that like the hollowing out that you're talking about, so they only have YouTube alternatives with reading groups that have essentially misogynists that are telling you what your diet should be. That's on purpose, right? I mean, the disbelief, the eschewing of liberal education or like even liberal arts, where you would get a variety of different perspectives. Rufo, to bring him back into the conversation, is so aggressive on that point. Because when you choke off those alternatives, it's also financial for people's access to higher education.
Yeah.
But and then you wage war on the liberal arts. That benefits them disproportionately.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's in a way. I think that the universities have been hollowed out because of, capitalism in a lot of ways, right? They've lost their capacity to sort of govern themselves and to protect the liberal arts and humanities. And someone like Rufo comes along and says, this is again, since Alan Bloom, this goes, and like William F. Buckley, this goes back a long ways. They're saying that the universities have been overtaken by these minorities, these critical perspectives, and they would say they've been hollowed out by and taken over by identitarian indoctrination. And I just want to say, I don't think that's right. I don't think his historical account of how this happened or why it happened. I celebrate, the critical studies, feminine, gender studies, all this stuff is, and like, yeah, you got to understand Black history. I think this stuff is great. It's been good for most people, for many people. But I do think that I think the Academy has failed to unite, to kind of square the circle, or at least like allow there to also be, to protect things like history, right? And including the history of the American founders who were white. The great books, when I was studying them and was drawn to them, so many of my professors did just think of that as a dead white male tradition. And it's extremely, it's anti-intellectual. It's turning your back on an amazing history of literature. And so there's been no, I mean, there are some institutions that do a great job protecting the humanities, having a kind of core education that's not, that's not against critical theory, but that embraces, that brings really genuinely diverse perspectives, but also allows there to be a kind of formative, positive dimension to education, and allows young people to ask big meaning of life questions. So I could go on about this, but I think there's something that's really important here about higher education that liberals have failed.
Do you think that I want to go back to Rufo a little bit in just a second, but just to address what you said, do you think that it is the absence of that type of education you're talking about, or the rolling back of that type of education you're talking about, is substantively problematic, or like rhetorically problematic, in the sense that it gives weapons to those who want to enhance the grievance?
I mean, in my actual opinion, I think it's both, because it's robbing young people of an opportunity. And I mean, I know that a great books program is not going to save the world, right? But it's robbing young people of these moments, and when you're young, to explore the meaning of life, to study great literature, to actually understand history in its complexity, not the like President Trump version of it, not the Claremont Institute version of it, but the 1619 Project, in conversation with more sort of orthodox versions of American history. And I don't mean orthodox, I mean, right? Like there's so much there to learn and grapple with. And I don't think our young people really are invited to do that as much as they should be. And it opens this huge opportunity and vacuum. I mean, you think my go-to person here is Jordan Peterson, right? This crazy Canadian guy who wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life that seems to have actually helped young men figure themselves out. I mean, he's totally crazy now. I don't recommend the book. I think it's like almost as bad as some of the worst. Like but it's amazing. What an incredible phenomenon, right? And it's a real shame that it's that guy writing that book instead of a whole bunch of young people flocking to serious programs in the classics, in American history, in comparative literature. And I think we've failed as a society to not fund those public universities where those things could happen. And I just want to say one more thing, because I know I sound like I'm a little nuts, but the right wing, the red state, the Republicans have taken some action here. They've started these civic centers in all these red states, which are basically conservative, institutions trying to like balance things out. And I've got friends who have been hired by these places. I'm not fully against them, but it's kind of a shame that you've got these hyper partisan initiatives that I don't think liberals, it's all very dispersed, but I don't see any blue state response to these issues.
Right. And these guys, meanwhile, it's like a PragerU Claremont project together. Festival, or something like that. We should say, you mentioned Chris Rufo. Rufo is the one he is a product of Claremont. He's now, I think, at the Manhattan Institute. He was from Claremont and Heritage. I mean, he sort of like hits all the hits, as it were. And he was the one who famously was on Twitter saying, like, when we say CRT, we're going to basically make everybody, we're going to make our people believe that that's everything bad. They don't need to know
like we're
what it
going to
stands
just be
for.
propagandists. He
Yep.
basically admitted, and twist. We're going to distort the truth to score political points, to change policy, and very sadly that worked, right? I mean, he
Oh,
was testing
yes.
the limits of I talk sometimes in the book about what I call ideas first politics, right? Where it's kind of like the field of dreams, like if you build it, they will come model of politics. And and Christopher Rufo was pretty effective at that, just building this huge movement out of a lie.
Yep. All right. Let me just lastly, it's sort of overarching. Where does the combined was there a version of MAGA? Maybe this was the first iteration of it that was, or maybe you disagree that this version of MAGA, all these things together, is fascistic. I don't know, but where is that? Like, where does it bump up against fascism?
Well, I mean, I think in the streets every day, when you have masked men stealing our neighbors, hardworking, innocent people, some Americans, into, vehicles violently and then deporting them, I think you're in fascist terrain pretty obviously. So, I mean, I don't go on about it in the book, and that was partly a rhetorical decision.
I'm sorry,
that was
partly what?
A rhetorical decision, right? I don't think it's very effective messaging, but that doesn't mean from an academic perspective that it's not true. And
Right.
so, and I'm comfortable saying that at this point. And so what do we do? I mean, I still think the country is extremely diverse regionally. I think this country is very vibrant. I think this stuff is very unpopular. I don't, part of what I wanted to do in the book was, show why it's alluring, track the history, but also to sort of sound an alarm and say this stuff is a lot crazier than you would have expected. And it's a lot more radical than your Republican neighbors tend to be, and so again, that spirit of generosity towards your neighbors and towards Trump voters included. I mean, there's a lot to be angry about, but it doesn't have to go on this way. I don't think this movement necessarily is the future of the Republican Party. Well, it might be the future of the Republican Party, but they might not be the future of the country. And so
Right.
I think that one thing Trump has shown us is just how dynamic things are in politics. And so I think that I do worry, I think I'm very worried about it. They keep surprising me by how far they're willing to go and the measures that they're taking. And I mean, I'm really upset about it and sad, so
To the extent that there's fissures
pretty
now,
awful.
where are to the extent that we're starting to see fissures now,
Yeah.
are those fissures in any way like ideological or intellectual? I mean, definitely we're seeing the polling that suggests that people, that your average, American is turned off by how aggressive, the Nazis in the streets with the bandanas and stealing people. But, But in terms of within the context of the Republican Party and its, sort of the intellectual foundations, we're seeing it a little bit at Heritage Foundation, right? Where they drew where some people, two new people left the Heritage Foundation because of Fuentes and Tucker Carlson over anti-Semitism, presumably. But is there really any fissures amongst those groups that you have outlined that make up MAGA, or is it really more just like, Marjorie Taylor Greene is mad because she's no longer going to be running. She thought she was going to run for governor, or Laura Loomer breaks off, or Candace Owens breaks off because this is just her business model.
I mean, there are important fissures in the intellectual side, especially around economics, some foreign policy stuff, where some people are more willing to go along with the old, with some support Ukraine and some don't, for example. But I think more important are the other fissures, right? Which we're seeing are just like everyday political fissures. The people I write about seem pretty pragmatic. The Claremontsters are willing to get along with the post-liberals. Some of them will destroy the regime. The rest of them are like they'll seize what's left and reorganize it. So I mean, they get along. There's the tech. I think the tech versus MAGA, Silicon Valley thing is interesting. I don't think that Silicon Valley is presumably, I don't think they're quite so captured by the ideological strains. Some of them clearly are: Thiel, Musk, maybe Andreessen. Curtis Yarvin maybe has had his moment. I think people see through that, and so they'll go where the winds blow politically, is my assumption, though. I mean, that's not something I can follow super closely or have been able to. So I think the fissures are real, but far more. And with the Heritage Foundation, Robbie George left the board of the Heritage Foundation. That was a very big moment. I think he's sort of leading the way. It's way too little, too late. In my opinion, I think it's just a joke. But I'm not a Republican, so I think that meant a lot to some Republicans who still hold out hope that this thing can be turned around. So that's really important. And but more important are just like the messy fissures, the disgust with the anti-Semitism, the Marjorie Taylor Greene thing is important. The Epstein files are important. So I think those things really do matter. Trump's very volatile. And I think it all makes, I mean, my own view is that it all makes JD Vance look pretty bad because he looks so weak, not able to say anything against any of it because he needs to just play nice with all the different ugly factions.
Well, Laura, it's hopefully we can check back with you over the next 6 to 12 months to sort of determine who won out, who's still standing. I don't know if that'll be the end or the midway point or just the beginning of
anybody's
whatever's
guess,
going
right?
on.
It's crazy.
Laura K. Field, the book is Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. We'll put a link to that. Thanks so much today. Really, really appreciate your coming on.
Thank you so much. What a fun conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.